Welcome behind the scenes of Socialize, a paranormal drama about the resentful friendship between two 20-somethings in New York who happen to be a bit stranger than human. Join me on this journey while I write, design, and illustrate this story in comic form. We'll begin with a set of 3 visual development pieces, chronologically presented in the order that I made them, so you can see the evolution of the idea. Our first piece began as a purely visual concept of 2 girls who we could learn about by the contents of their bags spilled out onto the floor. Eventually, I combined this visual idea with a couple of other ideas, like the parameters of a genre, vampire comedy, and the contents of a short prose piece I'd already written, and so became Socialize. I start from a physical sketch on paper. It both feels more real and tangible, and also, paradoxically, more freeing than digital. Real-life paper is great. I think a form of closure happens when the ink bleeds and smudges into grooves in the paper. Our brains fill in the blanks of what those smudges and textures could mean, conjuring up additional details that can translate to our finished illustration. So I began with figures floating in space, and upon my professor's suggestion, added an environment. Tool-wise, I begin with a rough sketch with a large pencil brush, into liner with the same brush in a smaller size. For most pieces, I choose a textured pencil-type brush to complement our traditional base. I'll replace the photo of our sketch with a picture of a blank piece of paper. Sometimes I'll photograph a fine-toothed piece of paper from the same sketchbook. Other times I'll photograph a rough watercolor paper. Other times I'll use cardboard or a black piece of paper with the flash on, like you'll see later in this video. The point is to remove the white of the canvas and give us some texture to play with. You'll see lots of undoing and redoing. This is a bad habit I developed through the use of digital tools. On one hand, I developed the scope of my style by being able to undo and redo things, and it increased my skill set very quickly. But, on the other hand, it does become a crutch at some point. Partially, the undoing and redoing is in an effort to avoid tangents, especially within the figures. Undoing and redoing the angle of the teeth, the slant of the bag as it droops over Prana's arm, and even elements of the background. One solution to rectify this crutch is to sketch traditionally, and even to create finished pieces traditionally, so I try to draw on paper wherever I can. The background came together pretty quickly, keeping in mind scale between objects and overlap. Things farther back in space will be overlapped by things closer to the camera in space, and the horizontal intervals between objects will become shorter in perspective the further back in space they go. You can see me adjusting the depth of the further back cushion on the couch to be narrower than the depth of the cushion that is closer to the camera or viewer. I do rely heavily on from-life references, so the apartment was based on my college apartment living room. I sat on one of the 2 couches and drew the background after having sketched the figures in class. Somehow the angle of the figures matched up perfectly with the perspective of the background, even though they were drawn separately. I painted the background from life, but the figures were drawn from imagination. With most of my favorite illustrations, I've rendered the figures largely from imagination. Photographic reference is great for accuracy and increasing understanding, but sometimes there's a level of stiffness that's hard to escape. Lots of life drawing sessions can give you increased understanding of gesture, body mechanics, and anatomy, expanding your visual library for moments like these, where you can achieve a more natural execution. And although the background was rendered from life, the details were also invented. I created this cleaner, curated aesthetic that I imagine Star decorated the apartment with. She's the breadwinner in this arrangement, she's also an influencer, so I made her taste reflect that with soft fabrics, a cute star pillow, and a simple, clean apartment. Then I'll begin painting and filling in the characters with flat cell shading, experimenting with how ambient light from the environment affects the local color of each character's skin and clothes. This background was my first time incorporating a very transparent set of brushes. The lowered opacity in these brushes provided lots of opportunity for layering. My favorite moment is the large gray carpeting. The cream paper texture shows through thin croissant dough layers of gray, creating a luminant effect. It's a little unusual to have the ground be the most luminant object in a painting, so it creates a floaty, surreal vibe for this interrogation scene. Especially with thin line art, it is essential to organize our values well. We can ensure that our focal point is readable within the composition by placing lights against darks, darks against lights, and concentrating the highest amount of value contrast within the figures. As you can see, the background is largely in the middle value range, while Star and Prana have both very light and very dark values, almost black in their hair and Prana's eyes. I drew the furniture all the way, even though I knew parts of it would be hidden by Star and Prana. The benefits for drawing all the way through objects and through characters is twofold. One benefit to drawing through objects is it results in more solid forms and three-dimensional understanding. It's really hard to mess up the trajectory of a line if you're drawing the line all the way from point A to point B. The second benefit is it primes the background for animation. My process is informed by animation processes and intended to make it easy for me to animate these characters on top of the same background. I also like to keep my lighting layers as separate as possible in case I'd like to change the time of day. The finishing touches on this illustration are some color dodge layers around the lamp to get this sunburst indoor lighting effect. You can see it clearly on Prana's hair where the brown becomes much more saturated. The final steps is one of the only times I will use an airbrush in a piece. I also add this pink vignette in a multiply layer to direct the viewer's eye to the center and support the soft, intimate vibe of the piece. Finally, I'll place the paper texture over top of everything in a multiply layer and lower the opacity. Between the intimate mood of the last piece and the moody character study that this piece turned out to be, the story began taking on a serious flavor. There's still room for absurdity and surrealism, but I don't think we're hitting all the aspects of a comedy anymore. You'll see a flash of green in a moment. That's the thumbnail I drew in my sketchbook. It wasn't a sketch with any amount of specificity, but it was a functional thumbnail to roughly figure out the composition. One tip is to write notes for yourself on the canvas. This is something I do as I work on the piece, and it helps me keep certain things in mind right in front of my face so I can't forget it. I place in some perspective lines to guide us in this three-point perspective situation. It's a very vertical piece, and I want us to descend down into the composition. I began again with a photo of a piece of paper, but this time I blasted the saturation all the way up multiple times until the saturation slider started to pick up on artifacts from the photograph. That's how I got that yellow and pink vignette. I actually didn't paint that. That was the work of the saturation slider picking up on artifacts from the photograph of paper. It's a fun trick I use sometimes to get rid of the white of canvas and to begin with a somewhat random base. In this piece, we're looking down on Star in a vulnerable moment. She's eating by herself in public, back turned to a crowd of strangers. I think it's a primally vulnerable thing to be eating out in the open and to expose yourself to potential dangers. The setting is a crowded diner by day, club by night. This was a natural continuation and experimentation of those transparent watercolor brushes I used in the previous piece. I really let the colors bleed between objects and through objects, using linear burn layers rather than normal layers, which increased the saturation of whatever color I pick, and they also preserve the underlying paper texture. My favorite moment of this is the transparency in Star's hand, where her hand becomes almost infected with the yellow of the table, crawling up her arm, and the brown of the fry basket. I also had the purple shade at the top of the image follow those vertical perspective lines. I did use reference for the figure and the general vibe of the diner, but again, details were invented. I still need to finish this piece. I left the poster on the wall blank. Maybe I'll put the title of the comic there at some point. It was initially meant to be a missing poster to hint at Star's underlying sinister activities, but that feels a little too intense right now. Finally, we have the last piece, which will serve as a key for the rest of the series. I begin with several thumbnails, exploring different angles of the same scene, rather than exploring vastly different ideas. I ended up picking the most detailed thumbnail. Usually my thumbnails are just a line, or they're only 3 or 4 values. But I couldn't stop myself from doing a whole value study here. This one turned out so vivid because this is the depiction of that short prose piece that I had created prior. It will be the very first scene of the story. I'll add some whimsical details to the sketch, like a rat, bugs, litter, graffiti, and a cat with a really tiny head. The animals have really small heads, while Star and Prana often have really large heads to symbolize their egos. I didn't want to go in the direction of anime with super neonized features, so that was not the intention. The intention was to symbolize their egos. So Star's surface level ego, shown also through her job as an influencer, and Prana's deeper struggles with her security. Initially, this was intended for animation, where there would be a transition between their heads inflating and deflating at key moments, which makes a lot more sense for animation. Here's that black piece of paper I was talking about. I place a black piece of paper, photographed with the flash on, underneath all the layers as the basis for our nighttime lighting. Like the previous piece, I'll be using linear burn layers to paint color over top of that base. The linear burn layer allows us to preserve all of the texture of the paper underneath, whereas normal layers, even with transparent brushes layered over top, would lose quite a bit of that texture. I'll play around with different poses and positions of the characters, exploring some options. Ultimately, I liked the original poses from our thumbnail the best. I'll render out the concrete stairs sparingly. That texture ended up being perfect to simulate concrete, so I won't overwork this portion of the background. I approached the brick texture the same way I approached the kitchen tiles in that first image. I create the pattern flat, then use the digital tools at my disposal to warp the flat pattern into perspective. In this piece, I added a slight bend around the edges, giving us a subtle fisheye effect on that brickwork. I'll light the top of the stairs using a very simple two-tone arrangement to show the plane change and define the form of the stairs. Then I'm using one little transition shade on the corner of those stairs, which I'll paint with a pencil brush. Adding some dirt to the floor, I'll use a normal layer in order to differentiate from the ground texture. Then I begin the line work. Thankfully, I had the pressure of a deadline to get this line work done, because no matter how precisely I tried to match the thumbnail, none of it was satisfactory to me. So the pressure of the deadline made me accept where the line work was at and keep momentum. The impending deadline helped me draw looser, helped me achieve this flow to the line work that ended up looking really good. While we watch the line art flicker away, I'd like to read you the synopsis for this comic. Practicality sticks a down-to-earth, humble vampire to a vapid, emotionless social media influencer. When Star's budding fame leaves a bloody trail for authorities to follow, her instability begins to shine. But Prana sees something growing in Star, and she doesn't want it to stop. Will their trail of murders catch up to them before Prana gets to the bottom of Star's new attitude? I'd really love to go the traditional publishing route for this comic, so I'm planning to complete a good 20 pages to pitch to agents. I'm not putting a timeline on this process as I do work full-time. This piece was drawn nearly completely from imagination. Shockingly, I did not use reference for the figures or the angle of the background. I believe the only thing I used reference for was the graffiti on the brickwork. This is atypical for my process. Typically, I use references for the more complex portions of the illustration, like poses of figures and proportions, expressions, as well as perspective of backgrounds. But I really lucked out with having a very comprehensive thumbnail for this and a very vivid image in my mind from that prose piece. I think that really contributed to the lack of stiffness and just the general cohesion of the whole piece. When I placed the shadows in, I wanted to let that watercolor brush shine and stand out as unique to other textures in the image. To achieve this, I used the watercolor brush only in the shadows and nowhere else in the piece. The figures use flat cell shading. The stairs have a fine grit concrete texture from that paper underneath. The paper bag has a painterly texture from a painterly brush and a normal layer. Also that the watercolor shadows would float against everything else. Starting with the black paper provided us with a darker base, which I accentuated by shaping the watercolor shadows accordingly. It's a night scene lit by a very warm street light with very hot yellows and reds taking up the majority of the composition. Final touches include that same vignette-shaped multiply layer and a very subtle top-down color dodge layer. I'll make final adjustments, upping the saturation in the shadows. I could talk for hours about each and every one of these pieces, so if you have any questions, leave them below, and I'll do a Q&A episode. Join me next time where I'll be completing this page and creating the first few pages of the comic. Also, if it's not obvious, I'm a certified robo-hater, and no part of this was done with AI. I even wrote my own transcripts, wrote my own script, I write all my own stories, I draw all my own stuff. So, AI.